Hi all, let's have a look at the World Chess Championship 2018, Game 1. At the start of the game, by the way, fans of Cheers would like to know perhaps that the Academy Award nominated and Emmy Award winner actor Woodrow Tracy Harrelson played actually D4 on behalf of Fabiano Caruana, but actually Caruana wanted to play E4. And a little bit of trivia here, the co-star Ted Danson of Cheers also plays chess, but conceded apparently in an interview that Harrelson was the stronger player. So it's nice to know that such a high-level celebrity is enthusiastic about the game. So anyway, E4 is actually played by Fabiano. We have the Sicilian Defense, so a welcome departure from Berlin or Petrov opening systems. So the Sicilian fighting defense, knight f3, knight c6. And we have here bishop b5. This is the Rossolimo system, or sometimes called the Nimzowitsch-Rossolimo attack. And here we have g6. White voluntarily gives up the light square bishop without being prompted. This is pretty standard move nowadays. There's two main alternatives. In this game we see d takes c6, which the idea is to put a lot of pressure later on d4 and even through this d file. A viable alternative, which we've seen before in quite a lot of Leela chess games recently, is b takes c6 as well, and this is the second most popular move, and this is also very playable. Black has the bishop pair still and the central pawn mass to play with, as well as b file. So there's two main plans, two ways of capturing there. This is very interesting. D takes c6 is the most popular, it seems, nowadays. d3, we have bishop g7. So black exerts a lot of pressure on that central d4 square here. An iron grip on that square. We have h3, which of course stops any potential pin with bishop g4 later. Knight f6, knight c3, and now knight d7. This has been a well worked out maneuver basically to get the knight protecting c5 and try and clamp down more on the d4 square by playing e5. So then both pawns are clamping down on that central d4 square. We have bishop e3, e5, white castles, and now b6, which frees up the knight potentially for an operation instead of routinely castling. Black's position is a little bit more flexible now that that knight is not tied down to c5. We have knight h2, which I actually correctly predicted during the stream, because my feeling about seeing other games from this position is that often, because black has taken like this with d takes c5, e5 is often a bigger target in this position. So white can put pressure usually with moves like f4 and maybe putting the knight back to put more pressure on e5 again. And also, of course, there's the issue of the semi-open f file. Now here, a slightly unusual move, not seen in too many games at a high level, knight f8, which reminds me of the first game encounter that was covered on the channel just yesterday. So Magnus, again, not routinely castling and using that f8 square, so accelerating this maneuver potentially to e6 to clamp down further on d4, which seems to be well in the spirit of the position. The highest level stem game I found in this position is black simply castling actually, and this occurred in Adams against Leko in Dortmund 2002. So this kind of thing is palatable, it seems, just to castle, and black should be okay. So this system has been used by the Britain's super grandmaster Michael Adams on a few occasions. Anyway, it ended in a draw here later, move 44. So we have actually, yeah, this is the first kind of novelish move, real departure, and it shows a really quite aggressive intent, actually, that black has the potential to castle queenside in this variation. So Magnus is really playing to the crowd, a fighting game. We have now f4 immediately. In fact, this position has been seen before in one game I found with queen d2. So that was Manic against Nader in 2010. And that ended in a win for white. That was quite an interesting plan after knight e6, bishop takes there, and then actually the queen was able to use the c3 square. So that was a very interesting stem game, and white actually got an advantage later. So ended up winning that on move 45. So queen d2 looked like a sensible move, but f4, yeah, this is now really going into uncharted territory here with f4 immediately. E takes. Now we have rook takes f4. Bishop e6, so getting out of the way to try and castle queenside. It seems the main intention here. Black really wants this bishop controlling this d4 square, so you might think a tempting threat. It doesn't really do anything, and then it should just be a small edge for white to do this. There's no point doing that strategically. But so bishop e6, rook f2, and in fact h6 now is played, which unveils a very, very interesting plan of a dark square grip, not just on the d4 square, but potentially, if black's playing moves like g5, that could free up the bishop, not have to nanny the h6 pawn, and the bishop can go here, and then there's a grip all of a sudden on the f4 square as well. So black has a strong dark square strategy here, unveiling. Queen d2, g5 is played, rook a f1, and we have queen d6, so really preparing to castle queenside. The queen is useful on this diagonal as well in some variations. We have knight g4, and now black castles. Knight f6, so a very interesting position. That knight is actually challenged. It seems possible that the forcing move might actually be fine as well, giving up the bishop here, because black has that nice e5 square. This should be about equal. But we have knight d7, less forceful, knight h5, now bishop e5, and black is actually threatening here g4, and white's king would be under scrutiny. So just as a token move to show that a4, g4, this position is a disaster, basically. Black's going to have a big advantage, whatever happens here. And if rook f3, bishop g4, yeah, it's a total disaster. Forking the rook and knight. So white has to do something radical, it seems, to stop g4, which would be black's major source of counterplay. So g4 is played by white as the solution. So Fabiano locks down on g4, and also of course locks the f pawn. So it seems a very logical move in many respects. Are there any downsides here? We have the move f6, and now b3 is played. Yeah, the queen is actually playing a good role on the attack here in some lines, believe it or not, and this can be demonstrated with knight takes f6, bishop takes, rook takes. There's queen g3 check, for example, and here if queen g2, then taking on e3, and this is just a total disaster basically. After king h1, knight takes, this position is massively advantageous to black. So we have b3 being played, and now bishop f7. The knight is kind of stranded there, just waiting to be captured. So this is actually quite committal for white to have to play from this position with structural damage on the cards, and knight can't go back from h5. It is kind of stranded here. we have knight d1, which secures the e3 bishop, which means in some variations with queen g3 potentially, that there's going to be queen g2, knowing that the knight is protecting that bishop on e3, so it's safeguarding the e3 bishop quite importantly. And now a very, very interesting move is played by Magnus, very dynamic, aggressive move. Knight f8, offering the f6 pawn. Black could have just played calmly as well with a rook move, for example, and it's pretty stable position, but Magnus is really showing dynamic aggression here, trying to play for a win with black. We have knight takes f6, so white is officially a pawn up here for the moment. We have knight e6. Black's idea is definitely not to take on f6. This position is very, very nice after queen g2. You notice, like, as mentioned, the knight is supporting the e3 bishop here. So we have knight e6, and it looks as though this knight is going to entrench itself on a key dark square, for example f4. Knight h5, which hits the bishop on f7. You might think, is there another way to attack that bishop with a discovery? Knight d5, black just takes and then plays d4, and this position with knight coming to f4 is very juicy for black. So this is just very, very nice for black. Black will be doing really well there. So knight h5, it seems virtually forced. Bishop takes, and you can see that white's pawns have been fractured, and black has a massive iron grip. Botvinnik would be proud on the dark squares here. We have so bishop takes h5, g takes, knight f4. What to do about this knight? It seems as though this knight cannot really be tolerated hitting h3, and the queen has always got possibilities of lending more support for hitting h3 in some of the variations. So it's snapped off. We have g takes h4. This is stronger than bishop takes. If bishop takes, white would be very happy and cozy on the light squares in particular, for example like this, getting a nice grip on the light squares with a nice fortressy type position, and actually technically in the driving seat, a big advantage. So g takes is the way to play this, giving black that dangerous road of attack to white's king. We have rook g2. It seems the engines are crying out for an exchange sack here, by the way, with rook takes f4. So technically this seems as though it could have been white's best move. And an example, this position, it seems the rooks are not too significant. They don't have too many open files, and the knight could find a nice home on f5, and this should be an even position with nothing much going on. The rook's kind of tied down by the knight, and h6 is a bit of a liability to look after. So that is a very tempting exchange sacrifice if one can see that deeply. I'm sure Leela Chess would have played this in an instant. So rook g2, we have rook hg8, queen e2. Here, the queen e2 is safeguarding light squares and provides support potentially for this h3 pawn, because black sometimes has an attack on h3 arising. As an example, say a4, check, and then here switching, putting the king on h1 first is best, then hitting h3, and this is awkward with the queen on d2. It's kind of unable to support the pawn, and this gets nasty here because of queen f7. In fact, white's getting a bit tangled up here trying to defend things, and could end up with a significant disadvantage like this. So a very important safety move, queen e2. White is playing, look at all of white's pieces, they're all on the light squares at the moment, whilst black is playing on the dark squares. If you were a fan of Mad Magazine, you might remember Spy versus Spy. It's a bit like that. Dark squares and light squares, except for this rook, of course. Okay, but rook takes g2, check is played. On a move like a5, knight f2, and white is really entrenched on the light squares. black might have a technical advantage, but perhaps nothing significant. Rook takes g2 is the way to go. Queen takes queen e6 with the big threat of rook g8, as well as, of course, eyeing the h3 pawn, but that's the big one to pin the queen to the king. So we have knight f2 getting ready for knight g4 in that case. Rook g8, knight g4. We have queen e8 hitting the h5 pawn. Queen f3 is played. Queen takes h5. So black has regained the pawn. And now king f2 is played. Bishop c7. King e2. Queen g5. Knight h2. Now here, there does seem to be a very, very tempting plan. This seems a little bit on the dodgy side, this king e2. There seems to have been a potential here for the queen to get to the dark squares, for example, like this, or like this, bounce via f6 or e5 into white's position. So this next move seems, it might not have been the most optimal. As an example, queen e5, it looks very precarious for white here. So if queen h1, that just seems so awkward. After queen c3, this looks actually quite diabolical after b5. So maybe somehow this was underestimated, this position, but it seems as though black's kind of getting the bishop in on the act to support the queen, and this is very, very dangerous. For example, here, c4, it starts to get extremely dangerous. Here's just an example where it's, it can be a complete collapse. So it seems as though this is an extremely dangerous move. If we look at rook f2, rook g3, taking here, that's just winning material for black. So this is, I mean, what does actually white do after queen e5? It seems as though, yeah, this is a really difficult position. Let's have a review of this again. This position, it just seems extremely difficult. But I guess it's hard to push this further with b5 to visualize this and b5. It seems as though Magnus had another idea which was equally lucrative with h5, and it does present some very, very interesting ideas to put a pawn on h4 in its own right. So there's different ways of playing the position. So let's see what happened. Rook f2, and the queen comes in for a moment here. So still same potential ideas to harass the queenside pawns. That's blocked. And now h4, which does seem extremely lucrative in its own right, to lock down g3. And sometimes there'll be the possibility of an exchange sacrifice as well. If you look at black's coordination, it does seem a huge amount of coordination on that g3 square. We have king d2 being played. It seems as though white might have had a great chance here, instead of king d2, to play e5, liberating the queen, hitting c6, and also this pawn could become dangerous in its own right as well. As an example, rook g5, king d2. Here, the pawn could be pushed, the rook could get behind it, and it should be fine for white. This kind of scenario should end up being absolutely fine for white. So e5 seems to be a shot available to white, but Caruana was getting into some big time pressure before move 40. So king d2, yeah, it seems as though the pressure was really up against Fabiano. King b7 was played. Now, at the moment, the exchange sacrifice is not working too well. It's something to be borne in mind already here, because it does promise a protected passed pawn if it's taken like this. Although that gives white temporarily a pawn, this scenario is an overload for white. It seems as though white has to be very careful here, but e5 does save the day. for example here, and there is enough resources for white to save the day here in this line. But the exchange sacrifice in principle needs to be looked at every point if anything changes with it. And we have king b7, and it's here after c3. It does seem as though the exchange sacrifice is actually much more lucrative than earlier, because this second rank has been slightly weakened with c3. But Magnus, perhaps, yeah, he didn't want to take too many risks and played bishop e5, but it does seem as though here, in this particular configuration with c3, that rook g3 is a little bit more effectual than before. After, say, knight takes, h takes, f takes, g is nothing, by the way, after rook e2. That's no problem, but if it's taken with the h pawn, this is actually representing a very big problem after queen b1. For example, like this, and then picking up a lot of key pawns, and this is very, very nice for black. If d4 instead, then yeah, picking up again key pawns, and it's looking really good for black. Black can actually storm over on the queen side like this with a big advantage. But yeah, Magnus didn't seem keen for that and played bishop e5. So very interesting. King c2, and then we have queen g7. Perhaps thought this was good enough, and if white doesn't play the kind of one of the very, very best moves here, white could get absolutely blasted. There is an alternative to queen g7. Just let's have a look at that before we go into that. b5, for example, b4, c4 is interesting, and if rook d2, then again b4 is interesting for black. Yeah, this is very nice for black. So there are interesting ways of playing this with b5. It does seem to crop up as a great possibility. But queen g7 does seem very logical to put pressure on the c3 pawn, getting that battery, that supporting battery. But Fabiano is very, very resourceful here. He plays knight h2, offering c3 pawn. But on the other hand, f4 is exchangeable for c3. White doesn't want to do a move like c4, weakening the dark squares. Here, queen d7, and then the queen potentially is coming in with queen d4 here, so infiltrating on the dark square. So if white has to play d4, that's a disaster. So, but this is a great move, knight h2, offering to swap basically c3 for f4. Bishop takes c3 is played. Now here it does seem as though going back with the queen might have been the best way. For example, like this. This position, with again the potential for the exchange sacrifice is on the cards. If we have this position, black's got a big advantage. And if we look at this again with a3, again the exchange sacrifice needs a revisit after taking. This is a very dangerous position here after queen a1. Black's picking up key pawns, and that should be really good for black. So yeah, but in the game, we have bishop takes c3 instead, swapping c3 for f4, and that does mean there's a potential now for queen f7 check and simplification, and this happens. Check. Now here, black played king a6 on queen takes f7. That's nothing to write home about. Basically, white will be very, very comfortable here. In fact, white could end up using the e-pawn to get a big advantage. If you look at this variation, very tactical line with the king actually potentially useful target still tactically. For example, here knight d5, so that if c takes, then there's e7 check and then queening. So very, very fascinating variation here, where white ends up absolutely winning. There's a check, and then here threatens rook takes a7, checkmate. So that at least picks up a piece. So yeah, it's very, very dangerous to actually take there. So king a6, queen takes, rook takes, now rook e2. We have, yeah, the rook has to stay on the second rank. If rook f5, then there's rook g2 check, embarrassing, winning the knight on h2. So rook e2, well, it has to remain in a seemingly passive state, but on the other hand, the pawn, the e-pawn is a passed pawn. Rook g3, knight g4, so h3 now is taken, giving black a dangerous passed pawn. e5, the rook comes round with this pawn, e6, rook f8 from the front, and now knight h6 to support the pawn with knight f5. So h3, knight f5, bishop f6. We have a3, b5, b4. There's less tension in the position, it's drier, and you might think, well, is Magnus going to grind this down or something? We have bishop takes e7, entering into basically a rook and pawn, a rook ending, a more clear rook ending. Well, here knight takes e7 was played. Got to be careful about this pawn. If rook takes, then just taking, and then h2, and nothing can stop the pawn. So basically pretty forced. Bishop takes e7. We have knight takes h2 here, going into a rook and pawn ending. And I believe it was Taras that might have said that all rook and pawn endings are drawn. Basically, black is a pawn up, but it doesn't seem as though there's too much going on now. Let's have a look. So check. This extra pawn seems more of a technical advantage than a practical one here. So, yep, quite a few moves in this rook and pawn ending. Magnus putting in a little bit of pressure potentially. Now white clearly doesn't want to go into the king and pawn ending, by the way. This would be totally lost. There'll be a Zugsman coming up here. So as long as the rook's kept on. So rook h8, rook g6. And a few more rook moves. And carries on a bit. And carried on past 10 PM, I believe, last night. It's a hard fighting game. But I think here at move 115, now both players agreed to a draw. So quite a rich game full of interesting opportunities, particularly ideas of coming in with the queen on the queen side here. The exchange sacrifice concept after c3 also seemed to be more lucrative when c3 was played, to go in for this exchange sack idea. So in some variations that did seem to be quite dangerous, but maybe Magnus felt he didn't need to take such a potential risk. But yeah, there was resourceful moves from Fabiano to keep the balance, it seems. So, but a very, very pleasant first World Championship game with the Sicilian Defense, thankfully, rather than say the Berlin or Petrov. So I'm very, very happy about the opening choice of Magnus, and he castling queenside. He really did make the game quite exciting and dramatic, full of imbalances. So very, very enjoyable game. Congratulations to both players, and congratulations to Fabiano to get to not be defeated in his very first game of the World Championship. So a lot of games to come. If you enjoyed this game video and the analysis, then please click on the top left box, which should appear shortly, to become a member at chessworld.net, and you can play against other YouTubers. There might also be thematic tournaments set up for this opening soon.
You can also check this YouTube analysis on the improved menu learned from the Masters, and any updates to it and any other games. Watch out for that as well. So just YouTube order on that menu. Comments, questions, likes, shares, subscribes with the notification bell, all appreciated. Thanks so much.